about building a bridge in biosimilars. Now this is information from the EU EPA for the biosimilar of Teva's GCSF, and also comments from the Teva website on the current submission before the US FDA. Teva built a very nice bridge to Amgen's pivotal studies. The CMC experts were clearly impressed with the evidence provided by Teva. Extensive state-of-the-art characterization is a very nice comment to actually get from a regulator. There was a pre-agreement between Teva and the EMA where they had a reduced level of preclinical toxicology studies that would be accepted for approval. And they also produced a relatively strong equivalency study of 100 plus pairs. The US FDA, as mentioned up there, weren't happy with that. They wanted a placebo as well. So Teva went out and did the placebo study as well. They put a position to the regulator. It wasn't accepted, but they moved on. Now, as someone with a background in innovative pharma, it pains me to say I'd probably register the Teva generic too. However, without robust efficacy studies to build a strong bridge and enhanced post-marketing risk management, I think biosimilars are a disaster waiting to happen, if it hasn't happened already in China and India and it just hasn't been noticed. Teva's efforts here are textbook excellent regulatory strategy. They put a proposal before the regulatory agency in an area where guidance was minimal or non-existent and highly contentious, and still is. And I dare say they were doing this while their competitors were sitting on their hands waiting for the regulators to provide guidance. It's an impressive example of positive attitude in regulatory affairs being a major commercial differentiator. And my advice is, if you want to buy a copy Teva's activities. Now I'd like to move on to local requirements and clinical trial issues in Asia. Now, this is a quote from Japanese guidelines. What the quote is saying is that the Japanese agency sees local studies as a safety and efficacy issue. These problems are real life, so you must prove that it's not an issue with your product. Now, the need for local studies in Asia are here to stay. It is interesting, some people rail at the need for local studies in China and Japan, etc. Personally, I think you ask for waivers if your product actually is suitable to obtain a waiver in these markets for a local bridging study. But if you don't get them, please don't view it as a regulatory issue. It's a commercial one. If the US FDA says you need another study, I've yet to hear anyone say, well, we're not doing it. But I've heard that quite a lot for Asia. It's a commercial decision as to whether you want market access or not. Teva's example of doing the clinical study in the US despite a specific study being required for one, albeit the biggest market, will probably recoup their expenses in several weeks after launch. Admittedly, the commercial decisions in some Asia-Pacific markets won't be so clear-cut. As many people have mentioned today, building Asian countries into a global development plan is quite tricky. And Japan has altered their requirements to allow earlier involvement in global studies and an increasing willingness of regulators, as the previous presentation highlighted, hopefully lead to truly integrated global development plans in future. Global development plans. Global development plans. First-tier countries like the US, EU, with Canada and maybe Australia thrown in, used to be considered a global development plan. The submissions and language are the same. Why not do a few non-US countries? Basically, however, nothing can distract a US submission or approval. A senior commercial colleague once told me the worst thing that could possibly happen locally would be an approval locally and a rejection in the US. Without US and EU approval, ongoing supply for any drug is tenuous at best. There's a chance that the product will be dumped. However, if you've got a local approval, you've got a massive KOLs that expect the drug to be made available to their patients, and that puts you in a very bad position. Essentially, US approval seems to act like a final proof of concept for companies. Perhaps there's a let's wait and see that we have this proof before we invest substantially in many other markets. Once you get US approval, though, corporate mindset seems to click over. The US has approved. Why won't country X approve it? It's all a no-brainer now, and it's almost like the country doesn't even need to evaluate it. And as for it taking 3 years to actually conduct registration trials in China, for example, and get approval, well, that's unacceptable. You must be able to expedite that, and then it becomes a regulatory affairs problem. This is all exacerbated if you don't have partners in in Asia, sorry. A colleague of mine once reported a situation of a growing small to mid-sized pharma company. Their global development committee asked the question, how do big pharmas register products in the rest of the world markets? A consultant was paid to investigate and came back with the news that those companies establish the local requirements, get the local forms in each country, and submit applications in compliance with those local requirements and forms. And the thing I find incredibly curious is what else did they think the answer might be? The big pharma companies have affiliates and partners, therefore language and obscurity of local procedures in Asia aren't really an issue, which just leaves resource and a commercial will. And they have those. So they plan taking into account the major local countries' needs, and they work to pull down the delays to local commercialisation as best they can. Clinical trials in Asia aren't prohibitively difficult. Most markets can have approval for clinical trials within 4 months. You need to take into account that some markets, such as Korea, China and Japan, have quite complex regulatory packages, sort of like a US IND or a UK CTX, and that needs to be translated. Producing those packages in local format and getting translations takes some time. And you also want to find a local partner who will arrange a pre-submission meetings with Chinese and Japanese regulators, for example, so that you can outline your development plans and future long-term goals for this product. There is a lot of pre-work before the submission actually starts. It's not like you can say, I want to do a study now, and then 4 months later you have an approval. Ethics submissions across the board have the usual protocols, informed consent, IBs, with minor variations, and there's nothing truly startling about the requirements apart from translations, which are not unexpected. China as the standout in this regulatory table. If you add a ballpark of a year to get clinical approval, a year to conduct a local study, and a year to get regulatory approval, then 3 years sounds quite optimistic, and that's because it is optimistic. A truly global development plan should start with China early in the process, and then start building those submissions and discussions with the regulator as early as possible. Big pharmas with offices in all of these markets plan all of this type of thing routinely. Time for smaller markets around when the right CPP will be available from the right country. And then for markets that need a local study, commercial decisions of when you want to allocate the resources relative to a planned US approval date then becomes the only issue. In a pragmatic world, even if you didn't start a major Asian clinical program until a US approval was obtained, there is still a lot of cheap work that can be done. You could roll out the protocol generation, the clinical trial submissions to the regulatory agency, pre-submission meetings, etc. You can do all that before you actually get a patient on drug. And that's when the biggest expenses are locked in and become a little more difficult to terminate if you get a bad result in the US. Now that's great for big pharma, but what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us? That leads to my final rule. Build expert partnerships. You need local partners in each market. Legally, you need a presence in the markets, but you need to think of it in two ways. You need a development partner early in the piece, and you need a commercial partner who's going to come on board sometime later. A development partner isn't interested in the truly contentious commercial issues of royalties, margins, sales force size, marketing spend. They are only interested in getting the drug approved. And that is a lot less problematic and time-consuming than the commercial negotiations in my experience. The goal is to have your product in local market development in parallel with your commercial due diligence of sourcing, in your due diligence of sourcing a commercial partner or even setting up an affiliate office locally. That way you minimize the regulatory impact upon the value of your product from eroded patent life, and maybe even increase your negotiation position with potential partners in actually having a product that is more tangible as opposed to a maybe situation. And I'd like to finish with the fact that Google tells me there are 48 countries in Asia, and so unless Pfizer has offices in the Maldives and East Timor, I suspect there isn't a company in the world that can operate in Asia with our partners. Thank you.